The shockwaves surrounding the federal Conservative leadership race really have not dissipated since the startling developments in the opening days of the race that three top would-be candidates are taking a pass. Former interim leader Rona Ambrose, former Quebec Premier Jean Charest, and current Ontario MP Pierre Poilievre all had plenty of money and backing to mount a competitive bid, but all declined. Does this say something more profound about the state of our politics in Canada today? Let's find out from a group of political watchers and practitioners who spent plenty of time in the trenches. In the nation's capital, from our studio at Carleton University, there's Robin Sears. Now with Earnscliffe, he was an NDP strategist for 2 decades. Also joining us from Ottawa, Ginny Roth, now Crestview Strategies National Practice Lead for Government Relations. She used to organize for the PC Party at Queen's Park. And Susan Delacourt, national columnist and political commentator for the Toronto Star. And back here in T-Dot, there's Richard Mahoney, Managing Director, Chair of the Advisory Board of the Macmillan Vantage Advisory Group. He's also a 2-time Liberal candidate for MP. And if I may add, back in the day, we used to do a show here called Fourth Reading, all about Queen's Park. And you were our regular Liberal panelist, and we are so glad to have you back in that chair.
Great to be here.
And for our folks in the nation's capital, great to have you alongside as well. Let me set this up. We have a federal government which just won its weakest mandate of any government in Canadian history, just a third of the total votes. We have a prime minister who many people consider politically vulnerable right now. We have a list of candidates for the Conservative Party leadership and maybe also for the Ontario Liberal leadership who have thought long and hard about being either prime minister and premier, and yet many of the so-called A-list candidates are taking a pass on those leadership races. Robin, start us off. Is there something about politics today that makes the prize of being prime minister or premier just not worth it anymore?
I think you can start a little lower on the totem pole, Stephen. It's as Susan said recently in a piece that I thought was very wise, that it's the defamation or the constant critique of every public official in elected office at every level of government, starting with the city. Yes, leaders get more of a whack than the people who report to them and in their caucuses, but boy, I know a lot of very unhappy MPs, and the Samara Centre, the group that does studies of Parliament, just released a study about the exit interviews of the ones who retired from the last Parliament. It's really depressing reading, Steve. I mean, the members do not treat the period that they had serving in public office as the greatest time in their life. So I think that's the broader canvas of this problem. But at the risk of offending Ginny, I would also add, I think there is a crisis in Conservative parties in all of the Anglosphere. If you look at the GOP with Trump and Boris Johnson in the UK, Australia and New Zealand, all have this dilemma of what are they anymore? Are they really a party that stands for a set of clear and persuadable principle? To be gentle about it, I guess I would say that's not obvious.
Let's come back to that angle a little bit more later. Susan, not too long ago in your newspaper, you wrote a column about this very thing. What are you seeing out there right now?
Well, I linked it maybe shallowly to Harry and Meghan, because it did seem for the first few weeks of this year, all we were covering were people opting out of public life and deciding to take a life less public. And I think some of it has to do, I will say it outrightly, I may be drummed out of it, have to turn in my membership card, but some of it is the media. We are certainly hard taskmasters. I would say social media as well, the climate out there. I would say also too, to go into what Robin's saying, I have been watching politicians here in Ottawa for a long time. The life doesn't look all that fun, and you don't go into politics to have fun. But it is true now, you're not allowed to have friends in other parties. There's a polarization and a toxicity to the debate around here. There is a lot of travel. There is intense scrutiny on everything you do. And I think a lot of people just decide, you know, I could make more money outside here. For a lot of promising people in the private sector, that is true. I'm allowed to have friends in other parties. And I'm not going to be cringing every time I look at social media and finding out that I am the devil incarnate or whatever else people say about politicians on there too. So I think there's a combination of factors that have made everything about it unappealing and very little bit about it appealing.
Ginny, just before I get you to weigh in, let me just read an excerpt of the aforementioned column that Susan wrote not too long ago. None of the three, and by that she means the three Conservative leadership would-be candidates who didn't get in, none of the three talked about a desire to be financially self-sustaining as Harry and Meghan did. But the raw reality is that for two of these three non-contenders, private life is also more lucrative and far less judgmental. Drawing a public salary opens a person up to harsh scrutiny, as outgoing Conservative leader Andrew Scheer learned about taking subsidies to send his kids to private school. Some politicians are so sensitive to this scrutiny now that they never fly in business class. They can now wave to corporate flyers such as Ambrose and Charest at the front of the plane while they make their way to the economy seats in the back. Ginny, how much of the overly partisan toxicity of our politics today do you think explains why people are taking a pass on getting in?
Some of it. I'll do a couple things to respond to that. First, I think we should decouple the different standard that elected officials are held to from the toxicity of the sort of partisanship and the 24-hour news cycle, because I think one's good and the other's not great. Holding politicians and elected officials and candidates for office to a higher standard is not a bad thing. The notion that an MP should try to fly economy instead of taking their points and sitting at the front of the plane, I don't think is a bad thing. And having politicians be aware of that and really hyper-conscious of how they appeal to the average person is also not a bad thing. So that's 'twas ever thus, and I think that's okay. I think that's good. Some of the toxicity that exists in Ottawa, and I think less so at legislatures across the country, I think it's particularly bad in Ottawa, between partisans has changed, and that is for the worse. And the media piece, the sort of scrutiny piece, has changed because of the nature of social media, and not just social media, but what it's done to the news cycle and this sort of 24/7, 24-hour news cycle of always on. The idea, this sort of desire for authentic communication from politicians that opens them up to direct one-on-one engagements through the media and with the media in a way that they previously wouldn't have had or would have been much more controlled. And those are all really disincentives for people to run. Now, the third piece I'd throw in that I think is important and that the average person maybe doesn't think about as much is it's really hard. It's really hard to run a national leadership campaign. It is grueling, it is 24/7, and you cannot have a personal or family life. You don't go on vacation, you don't see your kids. That's just the job. And frankly, I think it was good to see that people seriously considered that in their decision-making about whether or not to run. Pierre Poilievre scrummed after he decided to run and spoke to media and was really honest about saying, I have an infant daughter, and now is just probably not the best time for me to miss out on that part of my kid's life. And I think that's a really good reason not to do it. So I wouldn't want to not spend time thinking about that, because I think that's a really important part of it.
Rick, what do you see?
So just picking up what Ginny said there, I think it's right what Ginny just said about Pierre Poilievre and his daughter, but as columnists pointed out, Pierre Poilievre knew he had a one-year-old daughter when he was putting together a leadership campaign, when he was raising money to run in the campaign. So it wasn't as if, maybe he had a period of reflection about what it would actually cost, but I suspect there's something else going on there and something else going on in the Conservative Party. Robin pointed to a bit of a crisis that's happening in Conservative parties. There may be something else happening, related things happening here. But I do think your general question is right. Everything that Ginny and Susan said is correct about media, although that's always been there. Steve, you've been holding politicians to account for many years now. I won't say how many. And you know, if you make a mistake, you can be shamed and so forth in the media, and your career can end quickly. The difference now in social media is it happens so much more quickly. It happens so much more widely. You know, if your shame before was you didn't like being on the front page of the Globe and Mail, that's one thing. And your career ends, you know, or dissipates rather quickly. Now it happens with much more fierceness, much more ferocity, I should say, much more speed, and it's just wider.
You know Meredith Kaplan?
I do.
Meredith Kaplan's brother David, the late great David Kaplan, was a cabinet minister at Queen's Park. Her mother was a cabinet minister at Queen's Park and in the federal parliament. And she tweeted the other day, maybe because For all the good you can do in politics to make the world better, the beating you take on a personal level by media, Twitterverse, and armchair pundits isn't worth it. It's brutal. You need thick skin and an ego that can fend off character assassinations. Does she exaggerate?
No, I don't think so. I think the beating's always been there, but the beating is harder, it's more ferocious now, it's more immediate, and it's more widespread. In the past, lots of people have said, look, I'll just, I'll run. They probably, most candidates, as Robin mentioned the Samara study, he's absolutely right. I think most candidates get in without really taking into account the beating that they will ultimately probably get. Whoever leaves office, in a state of great affirmation and support. The odd politician, the Bill Davises and the Frank McKennas, pretty well everybody else, as you've written a couple of books on, leaves with the agony of defeat and shame. And so I think it's just a little bit more pronounced now. I think people are aware of it a bit more. They maybe observe it a bit more than they did 25 or 30 years ago. And so they're able to empathize. But there's still a whole bunch of them go in not even ready to take that.
Well, Robin, let me follow up with the Jean Charest story, because once he let it be known that he was interested in potentially pursuing the Conservative Party leadership, all of a sudden we started to see stories in the media that were leaked about the work that he'd done on the Huawei file for the law firm that he was affiliated with. We started to see 15-year-old stories about his time as Premier of Quebec when there were some shenanigans going on in business in that province. Do you think he was the victim of dirty tricks and ultimately just decided, to hell with this, I don't need it?
I think that's too stark, if I may, Steve. I think let's be candid here about what was. Politics has always been a rough game. People have always played very dirty tricks on their opponents and said very wicked things about them. They didn't get as much velocity as quickly, as Richard points out. But that's been part of politics since day one. That great quote of Disraeli's, every political career ends in one of three ways: death, defeat, or dishonor. That was 150 or more years ago. But I think what has changed is that the positive elements of a career in politics, friendships that cross party lines, a sense of achievement legislatively, some ego satisfaction about what you've gotten kudos for doing, those have all faded badly, whereas the negatives have risen significantly. And I think it's that change in the balance between the two, which is really new. I mean, the Samara study also said, for example, 2/3 of the retiring MPs were dissatisfied or very dissatisfied with the civil discourse in politics. Well, if you go to the office every day, as it were, facing a really unpleasant experience with everybody you're going to be dealing with during the day, you're going to change jobs. And I think that's the nightmare in political life right now. We've taken away a lot of the appeal and the sense of achievement and replaced it with a constant hectoring, raining down on your head from social media. That's the balance we've got to figure out how to get closer to balance again, if I can put it that way.
Susan, I neglected to mention as well that Stephen Harper's associates let it also be known that if Jean Charest was going to get into the race, Mr. Harper was going to work very hard, maybe behind the scenes, maybe actually in front of the scenes, to make sure that Mr. Charest was not successful. Does the combination of all of this, in addition to what we've been talking, make the prize less appealing nowadays?
To me, Ginny probably knows the party better than I do. I'm talking as an observer of the party, but it did speak to me about a certain unease still between the old progressive Conservatives and the Harper's party. And I think it was a drumbeat to say that Stephen Harper now controls that Conservative Party, and the old party of Brian Mulroney, Jean Charest, is now part of history. Can I say one little thing just about,
Please.
I wanted to toss in about the difference between media and social media. I say again, as somebody who's been here for a long time, I have tried to live this way. I think I have. As a member of the media, it is my job to be critical and to find, to critique leaders and to find fault with them. But I have adhered to a principle that I never write anything about somebody that I wouldn't say to their face. Because Ottawa is a small world, and you have to see the people that you critique. I think the difference between social media now is that all bets are off. That people do this They scream and yell at politicians in a way they would never do so to their face. It's not just a lack of civility, it's a lack of empathy or understanding, too. Donald Trump has not helped this, by the way. We haven't even mentioned what he's done to this. Politicians also demonize themselves by picking on each other and portraying the other one as evil now. Doesn't inspire faith in the public as well. And that to me has been a real tone change over the last, I'd say, 10, 15 years, is you hear things in question period that you never, ever would have heard politicians call each other before. Liars, corrupt, criminals. It's just, it's a whole new level of discourse.
Ginny, I do want to pick up on a particular Conservative Party angle with you, since you do know the party so well, and it's picking up on what Rick had to say just a few moments ago as to the would-be campaign of Pierre Poilievre, who had gone so far as to, in essence, set up an entire organization to announce a date at which he was going to announce that he was getting into the race, and then literally just a few days before that announcement was to take place, he drops out. I'm trying to get a better understanding. I really don't mean this to be a smart-ass question. I really don't. But how does a guy who's been an MP since he was 24 come to the realization 3 days before he's set to announce that he's going to run for the leadership of his party that he didn't appreciate how hard all this was going to be on his family?
So I can only take Pierre at his word. I think to really test the waters, and we've watched a few people do this over the last number of weeks. Jean Charest sort of did the same thing. To really test the waters, you kind of have to act like you're really running. To be able to answer that question yourself about whether or not you want to run, you have to start running and then see what happens. And so people construct, gates. They decide, I'll say that I'm thinking about running, and that will be my pre-launch phase. And in that phase, I'll see how much money I can raise. We talk a lot about, I'll just say, we talk a lot about how people are portrayed in the media and that sort of thing. There are a lot of mechanics at play here that the average person maybe doesn't pay as much attention to, but the party has set up, the leadership organizing committee of the party has set up really stringent gates around allowing people into the race, having to do with fundraising and really high thresholds for that, and also membership sales and membership signatures, rather, which have a high number requirement and also a regional requirement, so they have to be in different provinces to show that you're a serious candidate and that you'll be able to compete if you make it past those gates. And then people also set up gates for themselves. They say, okay, friends who are helping me consider whether or not I should run, let's set up some tests early on, and if I can pass them, maybe that's a good sign that I should run. And to do that, like I said, you kind of have to act like you're really running. So it can appear as though, the candidate was about to announce because they were, and then they have a change of heart because for whatever reason they think they can't win. They think it'll hurt their family or themselves or their reputation because they have to think about their futures if they want to stay in politics. So I think that's probably what happened with Pierre, or certainly that's what I can speak to based on what I know. But I would like to address Robin made some comments about the party, and so did Richard, and
sure.
I think. So did Susan. So, the Conservatives, by their nature, were not a center of the spectrum party like the Liberals, who sort of have the benefit of, having relatively amorphous views that can kind of shift with whichever leader they choose. And Justin Trudeau was a coronation, essentially, and so he can kind of put his mark on the party when he became leader. The Conservatives, much like the NDP, represent a more ideological, by its nature, grouping of people. And the Conservatives, in order to be successful for the last number of years, have realized they have to bring together those different groups and groupings of people that have some ideology in common. And when Conservatives have been successful, they've done that very well. And when they haven't, it's been because those different ideological groupings kind of split apart or can't agree on a shared vision for the country. That existed before the Reformers split off from the Progressive Conservatives. It continues to exist. The Harper era is the best example of when it was successful. So people look to that and look to, frankly, Stephen Harper for signs about what kind of a vision can unite that group. And what's exciting for me, though also comes fraught with challenges, is what Robin alluded to, which is the global question of what do Conservatives stand for. Boris Johnson had a really solid answer, and Brexit was a good pathway for him to do that. And I think members over the next number of weeks are going to have to grapple with, Conservative Party members grapple with, what what is the Conservative vision that's exciting, a winning proposition for voters, and which brings together that big tent and unites those different factions.
Richard, do you think that's a fair point, that it's harder to be the leader of the Conservative Party, so we shouldn't be so surprised that even some A-listers are taking a pass on it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I think the point that both Ginny and Robin made, which is, first of all, this is a very different Conservative Party than from what Jean Charest led years ago. So the calculation, I don't really understand why Poilievre decided not to get in. He was, by all accounts, your question was the right one, a leading candidate, and then all of a sudden he wasn't a candidate. So either he didn't, as Ginny suggested, maybe find in the soundings enough support, or something else went on. In Charest's case,
what does that mean?
Or there was some move to block him. There was some discouragement at high levels. I don't know, something. I'm now speculating because I really don't know. But I think we do know what happened to Charest. And I think all the things we've talked about were probably relevant. But the real thing that happened to Charest is what Charest said happened to Charest, which is he began to make the calls. The Mulrooney's were making calls on his behalf. The money was being raised. All the things that are supposed to happen were happening. And what he found out is that the party that he led 25 years ago no longer exists. It's a different party now. It is more like what Ginny described. And that means he's not the ideal leader for that. I might think that he would be a terrifically difficult opponent for the Liberals to face, but that's more in the mold that Ginny talked about, the more centrist kind of accommodation. That party, the Conservative Party of Canada, is not that party anymore, and I think he realized he would not win the leadership of that party. So in his case, you could combine all the things with the fact that it's now a very conservative, small C Conservative Party, very right of center, and the views of his, moderate on social issues, reasonably moderate even on economic issues generally, don't find a home there anymore.
Robin, I'm going to take this opportunity to ask you something that I don't think I've ever asked you before, which is, you've been around politics for a very long time and you've helped a lot of people get elected over the years, but I'm not sure well, you tell me. Have you ever put your name on a ballot yourself? I don't recall that you ever did. Have you?
Never did. And I'll tell you why, Steve.
Go ahead.
It's very much part of my childhood experience. I grew up with politicians and journalists because my grandfather was an MP, my father was a journalist, and I saw too many alcoholic, bankrupt, divorced men who were politicians. And by the time I was a teenager, I realized that was a life of a brutality I didn't really want to have a part of, which is really what we're all discussing in a different way here today. But Steve, I have never, in the 10 years I was a headhunter, in all the decades in politics, I can say I have never seen a genuine resignation for family reasons.
Right.
It is always a con. And we will hear the real reason that Poilievre decided it was wise for him not to put his name forward soon. There are lots of rumors going around the political village in Ottawa. And I think that the dilemma that presenting it that way as Ginny has done doesn't really address the deeper questions of what needs to change in the Conservative Party for it to be sufficiently appealing to people like those who've withdrawn. I thought that Andrew Coyne did a very thoughtful piece about this in comparing the cultures of the three parties. And, well, four, I guess, he included Reform. But he made the case that Conservatives have to stop thinking exclusively about who is going to defeat the Liberals and form a government, and think a great deal more, as Reformers did, as New Democrats still do, about why they're in politics and what principles are they going to fight to achieve, and face the prospect of defeat often in the defense of those principles. I could not articulate the principles that motivate the Canadian Conservative Party today. And I think that's a real problem, because when you become simply a campaign machine, it isn't very attractive for somebody to put their lives on hold and at risk simply to buy a ticket in that lottery, which hasn't paid off very often in the past.
Susan, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I think we should also talk, it's not a non sequitur, about what's happened with party fundraising. Gone are the days where parties like the big tent Conservatives and the big Liberal Party could rely on big donations, and corporations donated to both parties to keep them in. We live in a land now of no public subsidies, and parties appealing for small donations, which it drives a race to the extremes and to the emotional and to get your base fired up. That is, I regret these changes. I think they were done for a good reason, the fundraising changes, but I think what has happened is that it has turned every politician into a fundraising machine based on tiny things and whipping up emotions at the base.
Well, we're less than 10 minutes to go here, and maybe this is the time, Richard, where we could say we have pretty clearly analyzed what's wrong with the status quo. The toothpaste's out of the tube. I don't know if that's the right analogy. Maybe it's impossible to go back to a kinder, gentler time. But as you look at it, do you think there's anything that can be done to change politics, to make it, whatever the ills are, a more appealing thing for people of ability to want to try to do?
There's lots of things that can be done, but some of the things that we pointed out are hard to undo. The cruelty of it. I mean, the immediacy and the velocity of and intensity of social media attacks. But I think number one, probably this show and shows like this and columns like the ones written are probably not unhelpful, so that people begin to see politics for what it is and see the humanity in these decisions. And see the reasons why. So changing the political culture would start with a changing and political awareness of what it means. I don't think most of us believe that people give great sacrifices when they go into public life, but any one of us who have looked at those people and observed them, written books on them like you have seen that and observed it.
Well, you ran twice.
I did. I usually, if there's an opening, at the drop of a hat, I'll almost run for something. I mean,
having said that, now, admittedly, this was a decade ago.
It was,
so
15 years ago.
Maybe were not quite as toxic as they are today, but clearly you had made your peace with whatever ills there were in politics to think it was worth doing.
Yep.
You think you still feel that way about it?
I feel that way about it, not for myself personally. I think my own interest in running is something in the past. But yes, I still try to convince people to run. I'm working on convincing a couple people to run right now. So that would help. I think doing whatever we can to get rid of the excesses of our sort of hidebound party loyalties, things like that, so that MPs could actually have a fulfilling career if they're not Prime Minister or Minister of Finance, if there are other things they could do, that would help. It would also lower the temperature a little bit. You might not sling the arrow quite as hard at your opponent if you're working with him or her on a bill to reform the tax system, for example, or to put in a new gun registry or whatever the issue would be. So, but those are hard things to do, and generally when you get into office, you're not rewarded for doing them. In fact, much to the contrary. I mean, unless the political culture of our society changes, I don't think it'll change. And the last thing I would say is this. 30 years ago, if this happened, you would have said, well, that's politics. It's tough out there. Now you look at it and you say, well, that's a toxic workplace. Why would I want to go to a toxic workplace? So our standards have changed, too.
Ginny, what would you add to that list of how things might be able to be improved?
So I look at it from a partisan activist kind of lens, and I think that what I will say applies to the Conservatives, but I think it applies to all political parties. I think we have to do more to break away from always being an election machine, and other people have alluded to that, or a fundraising machine or whatever it is, so that we can create space for people to actually have real discussions about what a leader stands for, what a party stands for. Leaderships are really good opportunities to do that, but it's in the realm of an election. And so, maybe I'll continue the UK metaphor. I was out there for the Conservative conference shortly before the general election in September, and the strength of their think tank movement system in the UK across all sides of the ideological spectrum, certainly the Conservatives, but also in the center and to the left and the far left. There are dozens, literally, of well-funded think tanks that are doing policy research, testing ideas for their political merit, creating demand in the public space for new ideas in politics. At this conference, there are what they call fringe events. There are these think tanks hold events alongside the party. And we have a bit of that in Canada. We've got the Manning Centre for the Conservatives. The Liberals launched Canada 2020. and the Broadbent Institute exists, but there's just not enough of it, nowhere near enough. And so you don't have forums where people can discuss big ideas, where people can get trained. Young people who want to be involved in politics can get involved, get trained, get excited. And on top of all of that, because of the environment we're in, you've got young people the number of young people I talk to almost every day who tell me that they are just not interested in partisan politics because it's kind of dirty or unpleasant is really disappointing, because that just means that partisans will be sort of further marginalized, and the prophecy will be sort of self-fulfilling. So I think creating that space for thought leadership in an area that can be partisan would do a lot of good.
Robin, anything you'd add?
There is, I'm sad to say, a stigma associated with partisan politics among a generation that is the age of my children and the generation younger than them. And what's really profoundly distressing as a partisan is that it's not because they're not interested in social engagement. The refugee support community, the environmental movement, dozens of social organizations attract millions of young people to join in a common cause. Well, a lot of that used to happen within political parties a generation ago, and now it doesn't. That's our fault. That's the party's fault. Nobody else can credibly be blamed for the decline of political parties in the West. But I think two things could make a difference very quickly. One is to be able to restore an opportunity for genuine achievement by a single elected member. Right now, they have virtually none. You know, a private member's bill is just a personal vanity most of the time. I think Richard's suggestion of encouraging people to work across the aisle on their shared perspective about a question that isn't necessarily partisan would recreate a sense of meaning and achievement for elected members that's frankly entirely disappeared. And I think the second thing is, it's a little bit cliched, but as Michelle Obama said, when they go low, we go high. You don't need to match the lowest level of partisan insult and rhetoric to be effective. Arguably, you can be much more effective by refusing to go there and showing to a public that doesn't like that kind of behavior, you're not of the same stuff. I think those two things in themselves would make a huge difference.
Susan, what would it take? We've heard some good ideas here. What would it take to get some prime minister or premier to entertain the notion of actually doing something about this?
I like everything that all of my fellow panelists have said, and I think they all go to the theme of reconnecting the people to government. I think the average person out there is not entirely clear what politicians are doing here to make a difference in their lives, except talking about, saving them a few bucks. But I don't think that people have, I wrote a whole book on this about the consumerization of politics too. I do think that if we started talking to citizens as citizens and separating out their consumer needs from their citizen needs, that might be a more interesting conversation. And I think the idea that somehow conveying to people that what happens here on Parliament Hill actually makes a difference in people's lives beyond just their taxes would be a good start too. I'm encouraged by, one of the advantages of the digital age is that you can actually see what people read. In the old days, we just had to guess at that. I'm really encouraged when I see what people want to read in the paper, and it's not the nonsense about politics. They want to read about ideas, and they want to read about people making a difference. So we're trying to give them more of that.
On that semi-hopeful note, I want to thank all of you for coming onto our program tonight. Robin Sears, the former NDP strategist, now with Earnscliffe. Ginny Roth with Crestview Strategy, many years at Queen's Park as an organizer there. Susan Delacourt from the Toronto Star's Ottawa Bureau. And our old pal Richard Mahoney, the former Liberal candidate, now with Macmillan Vantage. Great of all of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.